So then we are back with a more understanding from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, a refined in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end. As per Yeshayahu the prophet, we find a layer of understanding of the spring feast, autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. While then we study these documents, we find then the international news becoming more evident towards then the preparation for the autumn feast. Where do we find the autumn feast? Precisely then in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, from the 23rd verse until the 44th verse. So let's analyze then what's going on with the world, so then we can understand then what Yeshayahu the prophet has said regarding then the Yeshayahu chapter 1:8, regarding the cities of the Messiah returning on the land of Cush, precisely then the northern part of Sudan, where then the holy city is going to be then restarting a section of the holy cities returning. When we read then Galah or Revelation, you find the 7 cities of Asia Minor. You find those cities also returning, but the first city, as an example, is then on the land of Cush. So then, as we read then the news regarding then the BRICS, the countries then coming towards then the international way of trade coming from China. China then leads. China must be the center of the entire world's trade. We find then many ramifications coming out of this system, where then the world must experience then an unified way of doing trade. It does not mean the world is going to become a country only, but each country must become individuals, in each of them doing trade with a system as per Galah, when the Messiah then spoke regarding then the freighters and the system of the future. So then, at the moment we find then on BRICS post, very importantly, China and India must then set up a military hotline. At the moment they are only pondering this situation. Where do we then draw the line as far as the limits of each and other countries? We find them precisely then in Daniel the 11th chapter. Let's read then together the section regarding 11:5, and the kingdom of the south shall be strong. There is the limit. The limit comes when then next year you find then China and its powerful industry coming then down to Congo, and they will to close up many deals. What can we then draw from these deals? You find then the first section of the disc of Ezekiel, then gearing and then starting on. At the moment, India is taking place more evidently than Africa. We understand the BRICS, they are not regarding then the holy instructions, but then we find the first, second, and third kingdoms, kingdoms of the east, kingdom of the south, and then kingdom of the north. These are the designers. At the moment, China is taking then the leadership, but then India is becoming more prominent than Africa. So then, we must have a realignment of the situation. Why then India is taking place of Africa at the moment? Because we are not yet in 11.5. Daniel 11.5 is then the limit. Next year, when the industry of China comes down to Congo and they will close up many deals, then Africa must take place more importantly than India. Does not mean that India won't be important, meaning then the designing of the system must come from the kingdom of the east, north, and south. As we understand, the Chinese company, the industry of China is going to open up then a trade or a factory of locomotives in South Africa. Thus we are understanding then, and the kingdom of the south shall be strong. What can we then gather from this information? Railroad is extremely important. If we study the history of America, the great transportation period started with the trains. And very wisely, Mr. Chi decided then to have these locomotive factory to open up then in South Africa, obviously linking up then the countries of north. Precisely then when comes these trades from the north then can be linked up with the new railway system. Later on, next year when Congo makes a deal with China, then we can simply expect these locomotive factory link up then Congo with South Africa, and then the Kingdom of the North shall be strong. At the moment, India is then taking place more evidently than Africa, but only for a short time, because we are not yet on 11.5. 11.5 must take place next year, because the time is very close. We have only 10 plus 9 years of time of the prophecy spoken of the Messiah himself. So then, what else can we gather from this situation? China is then opening up a research base in Antarctica. Obviously, Antarctica has lots of natural resources, and some of them related with the oil and gas. Then you find many other deals going on. You find that China has closed up a deal with Brazil for more iron. Very important, because the Brazilian economy is absolutely destroyed. There is an article extremely important on BRICS Post regarding the actual situation of Brazil, and it's not very bright. You find Brazil then as similar as Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, where then drugs were then the main topic of conversation and trade during the time of his leadership. However, later on then came Castro and his team, and then they had taken over. At the moment, Brazil has an economy that is extremely fragile, and we used to have nearly 400 billion in money left aside, and this money is gone. There is no more money in the government. There is, however, a plan of 270 US billion for then the project of infrastructure. There is then the desire of 220 billion for then oil and gas, and another 75 billion then for generation of energy. But Brazil has no money. The president is going around and she's trying then to get more money to Brazil, but she is failing. She's running around with Merkel, and they are trying to hide behind then the spying problem coming from US. Very important point, because Brazil has no objective for the future. However, in next year, then the BRICS must be hosted in Brazil, and we can only wonder what the Brazilian president is going to say next year. Except the COTAN, Brazil has no other way of trying to get this funding of 565 billion to get this project on motion. Brazil has no money. These are the facts. The countermeasure of the situation is obviously COTAN. Brazil has 20% of the world's deposits, and it's very important for us then to use these in helping our friends, the Americans, to build up the computer, so then the computer can limit then the Chinese system. At the moment, the Chinese system has no restriction. When the system is launched, then people can do trade and receive and invest via the same online system, where then you have a private line with China where government can't get into it. This, you can imagine what's going to cause. People with then money aside, such as in savings, they're going to invest in the system. This, then, the return of this investment won't be able to charge taxes for it. Must have a computer where then people can receive and send and invest, and then the countries can charge taxes due. Let's then understand another point regarding the freighters. When people are doing then their trade, they are receiving and sending money via the same system outside of the control of the central banks. What can we expect when a person makes a purchase? The governments won't know what's in a box. They won't know how to charge taxes. And most importantly, the countries won't be able to handle the amount of packages coming to their countries. We can only say the situation. Brazil can truly help United States providing an unlimited amount of coltan for the production of the computers, where then each nation must have a module of restrictions or then regulations of how they want their taxes to be taken out of the system. What system? The Chinese system. Must have a linkage of the Chinese system and central banks, the Chinese system and the local banks, and the local banks and the central banks, and the central banks and local banks with each user of the computer, so taxes then can be deducted. If we don't have this, China will lead the world unrestricted. How can we understand this? Bitcoin is one example. And then, obviously, when the system is restricted, when the countries are then each of them coming up with their own percentages, meaning then what do they want from transfer of funding? How can they relate with the transfer of funding in the foreign exchange? How can they not violate the foreign exchange? How can they receive then taxes from parcels, from the freighters? These must be precisely then delineated so the computer can make then the proper adjustments and instantly sending the funding into the central bank so then the governments can function. At the moment, the USA then is not doing very nicely either. But the computer must then obviously put a limit on how people they do trade with China. It's not very complicated, but must be done very shortly. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.